Usually I've taken to giving you a guided meditation or reflection at the beginning of these podcasts. But today's topic requires me to take a different approach. And I'm going to start off this conversation today by talking about alien abductions. And I'm doing this because they're kind of an edge case to the human experience. They live in this place of being very mysterious. Are they real? Are they unreal? What do they mean? How do we understand them? And I think by studying them and thinking about them, we can learn really profound things about the human psyche and our relationship to narrative itself and how we make meaning. And I think you'll see within this podcast how, by looking at that, we can understand some really interesting things that are applicable to therapy just in general. And I've looked at about 20 or so abduction experiences, read them pretty thoroughly, thought about them. I'm going to take you through some of the patterns that I've seen repeated over and over again. The first thing people tend to report is that they've fallen asleep and then wake up, but usually not fully. It's more like a half wakefulness state, where they know they're kind of waking up, but they're also still asleep. And often this is accompanied by a sense of being stuck in place, like they can't move their arms or legs, neck, sometimes even the eyes. And they can sometimes struggle against this sensation, like they want to move but can't. But that's not in all cases. Now, the next thing that's often reported is that there's flashing lights. Sometimes this is seen with eyes wide open, and at other times, it's seen with eyes closed. And these flashing lights can be a lot of different colors. And then often these flashing light colors, they give way to patterns, intricate paisley patterns or fractal-like patterns, repeating geometry. And sometimes, again, this is seen eyes closed or eyes open. It can vary. Some people see these patterns projected on walls. They sound almost, to my mind, very psychedelic adjacent. And then the next thing people talk about is the presence of entities. And often this is not like they're seeing an entity, but they feel as if there's something there. For some people, this is expressed through this vague sense, but for others, they actually see the entity, a kind of mysterious, glowing being. Sometimes this is manifested as like a lizard-like creature or insectoid. Others report seeing gray aliens, the cultural trope, the kind of, if we think of what a gray alien would be, some people say they see those things. And then there's often a floating experience involved, like floating off somewhere, floating up through the ceiling, through an open window. Sometimes seeing the clouds or seeing their house or home or apartment below. And then there's a sense of lost time, like a lot of time has passed, more than usual. And people report then waking up, sometimes in bed, but sometimes in a different place in the house, and having often no idea how they got there. That kind of captures the broad sense of the abduction experience. And I'd like us to start thinking about, well, how do we make meaning of that? And for many people, they have this experience and they go to, well, I was abducted by aliens. That's what happened. And that's very dependent on the culture the person lives in. Whereas, for other people, they lens that through, those were spirits. Those were encounters with a different realm. Or for many Westerners, we might lens that through a neurobiological framework, saying that wasn't aliens, that was sleep paralysis. That was seeing the interiority of the mind during a liminal state, and so on and so forth. Or sleepwalking, these kinds of things. And so dependent on one's background and one's culture and one's understanding, one's belief set, people weave different myths, different kind of narratives to fill in the gaps, to make sense of the experience. And we're going to come back to this quite a bit through this talk about these different interpretations. One thing that I want to emphasize here is that the experience and the interpretation are not the same thing. This is really important. I think you already get that sense, but I want to be really clear about it. That I'm not trying to say there's one correct way to see this. I'm trying to say there's many different ways. And while I've talked about different cultures, I think it would be important also to just say there's different ways we can lens this through time. You know, this experience in medieval Europe would look very different than it does now in, 20th, 21st century America. And I think my point here that I'm trying to drive at is that we don't encounter raw reality. We don't really ever do that ever. We experience a subjective take on reality that we always are interpreting through all sorts of symbolic, cultural, mythological layers, right? And if we're going to penetrate this any deeper and look at it, I think we need to take a look at what is myth, because that's kind of at the center, I see, of this whole thing. As we spiral down into what's going on in the abduction experience, we need to know what myth is. And the way I've begun to think about myth is that myth is it's a narrative structure, right? And it's one in which we organize around, often because we have an incomplete view of the world. So we don't know something completely or enough. And so we generate a sort of narrative that fits it well enough to make sense of it. But it's tricky to talk about myth because myth doesn't necessarily mean it's something that's false. Okay? Myth is more like a low resolution picture of reality, but not reality itself exactly. We need to make these myths up to make sense of the world because we can't actually hold all of experience at once. And there's sort of three components when I break down myth in this way that I think we need to look at. The first one is belief, looking at how belief kind of crystallizes and how we make sense of the world. And this is often a kind of cultural piece. It's like what we inherit from the past, what are different ways we've been enculturated into society, the different shapes that the broader system we inhabit has kind of informed how we lens the world. It's our assumptions, basically, right? Belief. It's sort of conflated with our assumptions. Something we can rely on as sort of a shorthand to navigate our reality. Then there's a second part of what myths are that is about what I would call meaning. And that's about how we construct meaning out of our belief set and then with our experience together to create some sense of what has happened, is happening, or is going to happen. It's how we build and organize our experience, right? That's what meaning is. But then there's this third piece. And this third piece is what I find really fascinating, especially within the context of this talk. And that third piece is objective, kind of scientific inquiry. But here's the thing that we need to pay very close attention to, is that objective inquiry, using like a scientific method or facts or what the consensus from the culture says, it refines myth, it helps point it in a new direction, but it does not eliminate, does not remove myth from the picture. It doesn't remove our ability to construct these narratives and fill in the gaps. And so what we have to understand is that our access to this kind of bigger truth, this more objective truth, it's always partial, it's incomplete. There's lots of gaps in it. And this is a complex problem because I don't want you to mistake what I'm saying and think that like there is no reality outside of us or that truth doesn't mean anything. And again, I want to come back to what I said before about myth just in general, that myth is the narrative structure through which human beings organize incomplete knowledge. Okay? It's how we organize incomplete knowledge and how we make our existence feel doable, feel meaningful, feel livable. It's how we live, this myth piece. And so myth, in this way, is built into us at an biological level, at an organizational level, in a very deep way. And I think any time we talk about reality and trying to make the most sense of it, an idea that comes to my mind, at least, is one from mathematics. And I look at math because it provides a formal system to ask questions within. It really defined a system, right? It has really tight constraints. And math is very beautiful. It articulates these profound truths about reality. And for a long time, in human history, mathematics was kind of looked at like the gold standard in the sense that it was an arbitrator of what was true and not true. It had a kind of like cold edge to it where, you could put something through a mathematical model and get an answer out of it. It was like yes or no. It was a very particular kind of truth telling machine. And there was this sense, I think, going into the 20th century, like it could answer the most difficult questions, and that it had a kind of complete knowledge of itself and of reality. It was like an arbitrator. It was like the gold standard to test reality up against. And that's why it's so tightly coupled with things like physics, biology, et cetera, et cetera. But there was this guy that came along, and his name was Kurt Gödel. And Kurt Gödel studied incompleteness, amongst other things. He studied set theory. He studied infinity. And he asked these really deep questions about what is the nature of numbers themselves. But through his work with infinity and set theory and different systems, he came up with this idea. And the idea was that, in essence, any sufficiently complex formal system, so some formal system of logical operators or algorithms or computation, think about this in terms of like programs or any definable system in mathematical language, right? That there would be true statements that cannot be proven within the system itself. So just take a moment to think about that. That there will be true statements that the system can't prove itself. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around. And ultimately, what he's saying is that there's no formal system that can demonstrate its own completeness. That no matter how we construct logical kind of language, mathematical constructs, that there's no way to prove that it's a complete articulation of the truth, that it's always incomplete, in other words. There's this gap that exists. And when Kurt Gödel found this out, and then he developed proofs of it, it really changed mathematics in a profound way. Because he showed that it wasn't this thing that was immutable. He showed it that it wasn't this kind of gold standard that had no kind of problems contained within it. He showed that even our most rigorous systems, the most rigorous mathematical proofs and systems, they contain boundaries and limits. And this is the part that's the most kind of problematic for math, is that completeness is not achievable from within the system itself. And if we go back to kind of thinking about myth just generally right now, thinking about that issue of objective truth versus unobjective truth and what is truth, there's this kind of bridge within what Gödel is saying. He's saying that, no formal system can completely prove itself. But I'm also saying, and how I see that mapped on here, is that how we construct identity, how we construct meaning, how we construct myth itself, that gap that myth is trying to grasp at, it's kind of like the incompleteness that Gödel is hinting at. So when I kind of take a step back, I look at this and I kind of zoom all the way out, I can't help but think about Buddhist ideas here. Because in Buddhism, there's this recognition of this idea of emptiness. And emptiness is a mythological construct, but it has real applicability to our lives. And emptiness, the thing that should be said first is it doesn't imply nothingness. It's not saying that there's nothing. What it's saying is that there's no independent, fixed, the right word would be something like essence. Let me explain here a little bit further. I have a piece of paper in front of me, reading notes here as I record this podcast. And let's think about the paper for a second. So the paper is made out of wood fiber pulp, right? And it's been bleached white. There's ink pressed on the page from a laser printer. And if we look at any one aspect of this piece of paper, we can actually find the whole universe. For example, let's just look at the ink. I don't fully understand how a laser printer works. How did that get there? And what is that process like? And what's ink made out of? Is it carbon? Is it some other material? And where did that come from? And so on and so forth. And all of a sudden, very quickly, we're talking about the carbon in that ink being connected to the stars that formed in our Milky Way. And sort of like the whole universe is contained within this page, kind of reorganized in the way that I can understand. But it goes actually further than this, much further. It's more like for me to be able to read this text on this page or understand what a piece of paper is, I have to have all this kind of symbols and logic loaded into myself from the culture, all those beliefs. Those have to all run in the background in an automatic way for me to be able to read and parse this text on the page. And all that is context bound. And it's profoundly sort of mysterious, the process that's going on. And, what Buddhism is doing is it's saying, hey, these things are all empty. That's the word it's coding it as. And that emptiness is calling us forward to say that we don't really even understand at a fundamental level what we're looking at. This paper, well, it's kind of the whole universe. It's ink on the page. It's this complex language mixed with human history, mixed with culture, mixed with symbol sets, mixed with on and on and on. It's sort of endless. And for me to be able to read it to you, to think about it, it is quite a thing. So when I take yet another step back and I look at emptiness, think about how that exists within the context of myth and narrative and objective truth. And then I think about what Gödel was saying about incompleteness. So there's always these gaps that we can never fully know a system from within the system. We can't ever figure out if it's completely knowable or complete. I start to see this image. And this image is circular in its shape in my mind. And the image is of the Ouroboros. And the Ouroboros is a mythological animal. It's one that comes through deep time to us. It is it's often depicted as a lizard, snake, or sometimes dragon. And it's kind of like, imagine a snake that is wrapped around itself in a circle, right? And that where the snake's face eventually it meets its tail and it's eating itself. It's sort of devouring the very thing that it is. It's kind of looping back, returning to, right? So now if we jump back, thinking about that Ouroboros, back to that alien abduction experience, what that's about, let's look at it in a new way. So the events, we can look at all of them, what happened, the sleep paralysis in quotes, the flashing lights, the entities in the room, right? And it's sort of ambiguous. And so that happened to somebody. They report that as happening. So what does it mean exactly? What myth are we going to form around it? And we start to fill in the gaps, right? We start to have this interpretive layer that appears, and we start to make sense of it in this new way, where some people are going to pull in those belief sets and assumptions and cultural language and all these things to say, that was an alien abduction experience. Where others are going to say, no, 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 that was sleep paralysis with this and that and the other thing. And here is where the mistake is believing that the scientific frame, the rational frame, the frame that says that we can reduce that down to just the neurobiological, that is the truth. Because even if we peer into that experience very deeply, say we put someone in an fMRI machine, we put blood pressure cuffs on them, we put every device possible. They have, electrodes all over the body. We're drawing their blood. We're measuring all their respiratory functions while they're having this experience of this quote unquote alien abduction. Even if we gather all the data in the world, we're still left with this completely unresolvable question about what is going on. That there are assumptions and other myths baked into the scientific inquiry itself. And that from the inside of the system, just like Gödel says, it's going to be fundamentally unprovable. We're not going to be able to know completely what's happening. We might be able to divine or create some kind of truth from that inquiry, but we can't know it to an ultimate extent. And as Buddhism is pointing out with emptiness, that all of those different tools and techniques, they're all contingent. They're all predicated on other systems of understanding. And that the whole thing right then and there, it's all this complex web of myth after myth after myth after myth. And we maybe get closer to some idea of the truth. But as we do that, we also pull away from it. So then we're left with this sort of problem. If we say that the alien abduction experience, just saying it was aliens, that doesn't quite scratch it. But just saying it was, a kind of a rational kind of neurobiological interaction, I kind of feel like it leaves out something also. The subjective piece of it's kind of missing. So where does that leave us? And I think where it leads us is in this interesting place where we start to recognize that both the narratives we construct, the myths we live by, and the objective truths that we seek to make our experience fit into are both, in a certain way, empty, but also they both exist. They both have value and weight. They both really matter. Now, some of you out there might be saying, I don't follow. Wait, could you say that again? Or how does that map on? And I'd like to kind of shift gears and look at therapy in general, my work as a therapist, to kind of explore what I mean more by this. And I think you'll see the connection. So in the broadest sense, therapy tends to follow some predictable arcs over the long period of time. I'm thinking about the kind of depth-based work that I do with clients. And typically how it goes is that there's some problem that brings someone to therapy. Or they just want to understand themselves more fully. But that in itself is a kind of problem. And as time goes on and I get to know the client, they get to know me, more and more is explored. And we slowly but surely trace this path around figuring out who they want to become in the future. And that can be a long process. It's not an easy road. And often that requires exploring the past, the present, conflicts, all sorts of things. But then after sort of people get closer to figuring out who they want to become, and that project really starts in earnest, where they're really actively working on that, and then I'm walking beside them, sometimes this new thing emerges. It's a recognition about the myth piece, about how the problem they had in the first place, it sort of was like this piece of paper that I was talking about earlier. It exists, no doubt. The problem existed, as the piece of paper does. But as they begin to explore it and really see into it in a very deep way, they encounter that a kind of deep analysis of their life gives way to this recognition of that quality of emptiness and incompleteness, as Gödel and as Buddhism is talking about. That their whole life, in a way, was a constructed narrative formed around these kind of half-truths and approximate articulations, never the full picture itself. And then this kind of realization occurs that I've seen over and over again, where this is not an encounter with, emptiness in a negative sense. It actually really reinforces and kind of invigorates the project of existence itself. Because when we see deeply that the myths we create, the narratives we live by, are attempts to grasp onto objective truth, that they have limits, that they're bounded, that they're always incomplete, that they're empty, it shows us that there is such profound value in the work we do in the world. And when I mean work here, I mean how we show up as selves. The act of caring for somebody else, the act of showing up as a partner, as a friend, of living out one's life. Like that work actually profoundly matters. Because we live in this universe where things are always falling away, always incomplete. It's really an amazing thing when we see that the whole experience of reality, it really requires us to be pressed up against it. Another way I might say this is that there's a kind of liberation that's available. That Gödel, on the one hand, is pointing us towards how there's an incompleteness within systems, but he's also saying to us that incompleteness allows them to be liberated. And in the same way, with Buddhism, it's saying that everything is empty, that it's context dependent. And that context dependentness allows us then to have a kind of refreshed and reinvigorated appreciation for the forms of our existence, that things really do matter. We live inside myths. And, science, technology, it refines them. As I'm doing here and interrogating these myths, I hope that the philosophy that I'm presenting to you helps refine them and kind of get more precise. But then ultimately therapy, the work of therapy, it helps us loosen our grip on all the ways that we think the world is. But none of these things, that I've been talking about here, none of them remove the great mystery that's this life. We don't transcend myth, we become conscious participants in it. This inquiry into these things can be profoundly stabilizing, can profoundly life-affirming. And in my view, ultimately, this kind of inquiry into the self, into our experience, is profoundly freeing.